Imagine a museum. But this is not a bright, airy gallery of fine art, filled with the gentle murmurs of patrons and the soft light of a curated afternoon. This is a different kind of collection, a dark, subterranean archive of human experience at its most extreme. The air is cool and unnervingly still, carrying the faint metallic scent of old iron and the dry, dusty smell of cold stone. Each exhibit is displayed under a single, stark spotlight, isolated in the gloom like a predator caught in a hunter's beam. These are not paintings or sculptures. They are objects of wood, rope, and metal. They are machines, simple, brutal, and chillingly elegant in their unforgiving design. A large wooden frame with a grooved roller at one end. A heavy, pyramid-shaped cradle of dark, polished wood. A sturdy oaken chair covered in rust-pitted metal spikes. An iron boot with a fearsome, oversized screw mechanism. Each of these objects tells a story of pain, of fear, of absolute power, and of the desperate, feverish human quest for a truth that was believed to be hidden deep within the body. A pearl of confession locked inside a stubborn shell of flesh and bone. This is the arsenal of the Inquisition. For centuries, these devices and others like them were the instruments of a system of judicial and religious control that held sway over much of Europe. They were the tools used to put someone to the question, a chillingly sterile bureaucratic euphemism for a process of systematic, calculated, and often prolonged agony. But as we walk through this dark gallery of human ingenuity applied to its most terrible purpose, a question naturally, perhaps morbidly, arises. Which of these was the worst? Which was the most brutal? How does one even begin to measure and rank such suffering? Is it the quick, blinding, shattering pain of crushed bone? Is it the slow, inexorable, joint-ripping agony of the rack? Or is it the suffocating, mind-breaking, drowning terror of the water cure? What is the metric for a scream? Today we are going to attempt the impossible. We are going to undertake a historical ranking of the most brutal Inquisition torture devices. This isn't for a morbid sense of sensationalism or a cheap thrill. It is an exercise in profound understanding. By deconstructing these brutal tools, by examining their mechanics, their application, their history, and the specific types of physical and psychological suffering they were designed to inflict, we can gain a deeper, more visceral understanding of the worldview that created and used them. This is a countdown of cruelty, a forensic exploration of the engineering of pain, and a journey into the very heart of one of history's most feared and mythologized institutions. Welcome to Torture History. Settle in as we count down the top 5 most brutal instruments of Inquisition torture. This is not a list for the faint of heart. It is a catalog of human ingenuity applied to its darkest purpose, a grim testament to the terrifying places the quest for certainty can lead. Before we begin our grim countdown, it's absolutely crucial to set the stage and to dispel a few of the more lurid, Hollywood-fueled myths that cling to this topic like graveyard fog. The popular image of the Inquisition, especially the Spanish Inquisition, is often one of a sadistic, all-powerful, pan-European entity that reveled in torturing countless victims in every town square with an almost endless army of bizarre and fiendish devices. The reality, as is so often the case in history, is more complex, more bureaucratic, and in some ways far more disturbing for its cold, rational logic. Firstly, the Inquisition was not a single, monolithic, James Bond villain-like entity. It was a series of different, distinct legal and religious institutions that arose at different times and in different places to combat specific perceived threats. The first was the medieval or episcopal Inquisition, established in the 13th century in southern France to root out the Cathar heresy. Then came the Roman Inquisition in the 16th century, created to combat the rise of Protestantism. And then there was the most infamous of them all, the Spanish Inquisition, established in 1478 not by the Pope, but by the Spanish monarchs Ferdinand and Isabella, initially to ensure the orthodoxy of conversos Jews who had converted to Christianity. While they shared a common goal, the defense and purification of the Catholic faith, their methods, legal procedures, and the frequency with which they resorted to torture varied significantly. Secondly, and this may be surprising, the Inquisition's use of torture was, within its own chilling context, legally regulated. It was not supposed to be random or wanton. According to the rules laid down by popes and codified by theologians, torture was only to be used as a last resort, when there was already strong evidence of guilt, what was known as semi-plena probatio or half-proof, such as the testimony of a single credible witness. It was not supposed to cause permanent mutilation or death, a rule that was, as we will see, frequently and horrifically violated in practice. And, in a masterpiece of legal fiction, a confession obtained under torture had to be freely repeated the next day, outside the torture chamber, to be considered legally valid. Of course, the victim knew that retracting the confession would simply mean another visit to the chamber, another session with the tormentor. Finally, many of the most outlandish and ghoulish devices popularly associated with the Inquisition, like the iconic Iron Maiden, are now considered by almost all serious historians to be either complete fabrications from later anti-Catholic and Protestant propaganda, the Black Legend against Spain, or macabre theatrical objects created in the 19th century to satisfy a morbid public fascination with the so-called Dark Ages. Our list will focus on the devices we know from detailed legal records, from the harrowing testimonies of victims, and from surviving artifacts were actually used. These brutal tools were real, their application was methodical, and their effects were devastating. With that vital context in mind, let's open the door to the chamber and begin our countdown. Number 5. The Heretic's Fork. We start our historical ranking at the less physically destructive, but psychologically insidious end of the spectrum. Our first device is not designed to maim or kill, but to inflict a constant, nagging, and psychologically wearing pain that serves as a perpetual instrument of control. It is a perfect example of the subtle, symbolic cruelty that could be a hallmark of Inquisition torture. This is the Heretic's Fork. Imagine a short iron rod, perhaps 6 to 8 inches long. At each end, the rod splits into two sharp, two-pronged forks, like two opposing, menacing letter U's. The device was placed vertically between the victim's chin and chest, and held firmly in place by a leather strap buckled tightly around the neck. One fork, the top one, would press firmly into the soft flesh under the chin, its points digging into the jawbone. The other fork, the bottom one, dug into the chest, just above the sternum in the delicate hollow of the clavicle. The prongs were sharp enough to break the skin and cause constant, irritating pain, but not typically long enough to pierce a vital organ, unless the victim made a significant, desperate movement. Now, picture the effect of this simple, elegant device. The victim was trapped. They could not lower their head, even slightly, without the upper fork digging deeper into their jaw and throat. They could not raise their head or stretch their neck without the lower fork pressing painfully into their chest. They could not lie down comfortably. Most critically, they could not fall asleep. For the moment their muscles relaxed and their head nodded forward, they would be instantly and rudely awakened by a sharp stab of pain. They were forced to hold their head erect, in a posture of unnatural attention, often for days on end. The physical pain, while significant and ever-present, was only part of the torture. The Heretic's Fork was an instrument of profound humiliation and psychological warfare. It was often used on heretics who had been convicted of speaking against the church or spreading blasphemous doctrines. The fork, pressing against their larynx, made it difficult and painful to speak, a constant, physical rebuke for their crime. The very instrument of their alleged sin, their voice, was now being physically punished and constrained. They were effectively and symbolically silenced. Furthermore, it was a public punishment. A victim might be forced to wear the fork while being paraded through the streets, or while standing in the town square as an object of scorn and morbid curiosity. It was a visible brand of their crime, a living warning to others, and it forced them into a posture of haughty, unnatural arrogance, a cruel parody of the sin of pride, which the church believed was the root of all heresy. The constant, gnawing pain, the debilitating sleep deprivation, the public shame, it was a potent combination designed to methodically grind down a person's physical and mental resistance, to make them weary of their own defiance, to make them long for the simple relief of submission. The Heretic's Fork earns its place on our list not for its extreme physical brutality, but for its insidious, finely tuned psychological cruelty. It was a constant, inescapable, 24-hour-a-day reminder of the church's power and the prisoner's helplessness. It was a quiet torture, a torture of 1,000 tiny cuts, but a profoundly effective one for breaking the will through sheer, unending discomfort and exhaustion. It represents the more subtle end of the spectrum of brutal tools, but its effectiveness should not be underestimated. Number 4. The Pear of Anguish or Choke Pear. Moving up our historical ranking, we come to an object whose very form suggests a uniquely intimate, invasive, and horrifying violation. This is the Pear of Anguish, sometimes known by the more descriptive name, the choke pear. It must be stated that the authenticity of the pear as a widespread, officially sanctioned torture device is debated by some historians. Skeptics suggest it may be another of those later fabrications, or perhaps a medical instrument for gagging or stretching orifices that was later mythologized into a tool of torture. However, multiple, intricate examples of the device exist in museums, and its design is so specific and so malevolently purposed that it demands our attention as a potential instrument of targeted, symbolic cruelty. Its horror lies in its plausibility within the mindset of the time. Imagine a metal object shaped, as the name suggests, like a pear. It is comprised of several metal segments, or leaves, usually 3 or 4, that are hinged at the top and connected to a central screw mechanism. At the top of the device is a key or a crank. When the key is turned in one direction, the segments of the pear slowly and powerfully expand outwards, like a blooming, razor-edged flower. Now consider its application. This device was designed to be inserted, in its closed state, into one of the body's primary orifices, the mouth, the rectum, or the vagina. Once inserted, the key would be turned. The metal leaves would spread, stretching and then tearing the delicate, sensitive internal tissues. The pain would be unimaginable, a deep, internal, rending agony. The specific orifice used was often, according to the legends, symbolic. For a heretic who had uttered blasphemies or preached against the church, it would be inserted into the mouth. The expansion would stretch the jaw to the point of dislocation, break the teeth from their sockets, and eventually shatter the bones of the face. For a man accused of sodomy, a crime considered a profound violation of natural law, it would be used anally. For a woman accused of witchcraft and thus of having carnal relations with the devil, or of inducing an abortion, it would be used vaginally. The pair of anguish was a tool of maximum humiliation, a physical and sexual assault masquerading as a judicial punishment. It attacked the most private and vulnerable parts of the body, turning them into a source of public, agonizing pain. The internal damage would be catastrophic, leading to massive, uncontrollable bleeding, shock, and very likely a slow and agonizing death from peritonitis or other infections, even if the victim survived the initial application. If its use was as widespread as its legend suggests, the pair of anguish represents a particularly nasty fusion of physical torment and symbolic punishment. It wasn't just about causing pain. It was about defiling the sinner in the very part of their body associated with their alleged sin, a brutal physical manifestation of their spiritual corruption. Its place on this list is secured by this unique and horrifying blend of violation, humiliation, and internal destruction. It is a device that speaks to a mindset that saw the human body not just as a vessel of truth, but as a text on which a moral lesson could be brutally and bloodily inscribed. Number 3. The Strappado or Corda. We now arrive at the top 3 of our historical ranking, and here the brutality escalates significantly and is far better documented. At number 3 is a form of torture that was deceptively simple in its mechanics, requiring no complex machinery, just a rope, a pulley, and a high ceiling. But it was devastating in its effects on the human body. This is the Strappado, also known as the Corda in Italy or, in some German territories, the Queen of Torments. The Strappado was one of the most common and universally applied forms of Inquisition torture, mentioned frequently and matter-of-factly in trial records across Europe. The procedure was brutally straightforward. The victim's hands were tied tightly behind their back at the wrists. The rope, which had been slung over a pulley attached to a beam in the ceiling, was then tied to their bound wrists. The executioner and his assistants would then pull on the other end of the rope, hoisting the victim into the air. Their full body weight was left hanging from their arms, which were being pulled up and back at an unnatural and excruciatingly painful angle. This initial position, known as suspension, was agonizing enough. It would cause immense, searing pain in the wrists from the bite of the rope. The strain on the elbows and, most critically, the shoulder joints would be intense. The muscles of the chest and back would cramp violently, and breathing would become shallow and difficult as the position constricted the chest. But this was just the beginning, the prelude. The torture could be applied in escalating degrees of severity, known as trati. The first degree was simply to leave the victim hanging in this position for an extended period, sometimes up to an hour. The pain would grow steadily, from a sharp agony to a deep, throbbing, all-encompassing torment. The psychological component was also immense, the feeling of utter helplessness, the fear of what was to come. The second, and far more common, degree was known as the tratto di corda, or pull of the rope. While the victim was suspended, the executioner would suddenly release the rope, letting the victim plummet towards the floor, only to stop their fall with a violent, bone-jarring jolt just before their feet touched the ground. This sudden, brutal deceleration would send a massive shockwave of force up through the already strained arms and directly into the shoulder sockets. The result was almost always the violent, bilateral dislocation of both shoulders, with the head of the humerus bone being ripped from the glenoid socket. Witnesses and victims' accounts describe the sound of this happening as sickening wet pop or a dull, grinding crack, audible throughout the chamber, and the victim's subsequent scream of pure, unadulterated agony. This was an injury of profound and often permanent damage. The pain of a double shoulder dislocation is blinding, a wave of nausea-inducing agony that overwhelms the senses. But the torture could be escalated even further still. Sometimes, heavy weights, often made of stone or iron, would be tied to the victim's ankles before they were hoisted. This added more force to the drop, ensuring the dislocations were complete and catastrophic. This extra weight could also cause fractures of the collarbone, the humerus, and the bones of the forearm. This was the most severe form, reserved for the most obstinate of prisoners. After being subjected to the strappado, the victim would be lowered to the ground, a broken, whimpering mess. Their arms would be useless, hanging limp and disfigured. Inquisitorial records sometimes dryly note that a surgeon was on hand to attempt to set the dislocated joints, a process that would inflict its own secondary wave of intense, grinding agony on the unanesthetized victim. Often, the damage to the ligaments, tendons, and nerves of the rotator cuff was so severe that the victim would be left with a permanent disability, a lifelong, painful reminder of their time, put to the question. The strappado was a brutally efficient tool. It was easy to set up in any room with a strong beam, it was quick to apply, and it was virtually guaranteed to produce a level of pain that could break even the most resolute of prisoners. Its cruel genius lay in its use of the victim's own body weight, amplified by gravity, as the instrument of their torment. It earns its high place on our list of brutal tools for its simplicity, its widespread and documented use, and its capacity to inflict a specific, focused, and catastrophic injury with a single brutal drop. Number 2. The rack. At number 2 in our countdown, we find perhaps the most iconic and infamous torture device of all time, an instrument whose very name has become a global synonym for excruciating pain and suffering. It is the dark monarch of mechanical torture. This is the rack. We have spoken of the rack before in our explorations, but its place near the very top of any historical ranking of torture is undisputed and essential. While the strappado focused its destructive energy on the shoulder joints, the rack was a machine of total, systematic, linear deconstruction, designed to pull the entire human body apart, joint by joint. If the strappado was a sudden, violent assault, the rack was a slow, inexorable, grinding annihilation. The design, while varying slightly in size and complexity from region to region, followed a universal, brutal principle. The base was a large, heavy rectangular wooden frame, often raised slightly off the ground, looking like a stark, oversized bed frame from hell. The victim was forced to lie flat on their back on this frame. Their wrists were bound tightly with rope to a fixed bar or a set of rollers at one end. Their ankles were similarly secured with ropes that were wound around a rotating cylinder, the windlass at the other end. This windlass was turned by means of long, sturdy levers or a large spoked wheel. The procedure began with the cold, methodical securing of the victim. This in itself was a moment of profound psychological terror, the feeling of being completely immobilized and powerless. The questioning would begin. As the victim denied the charges, the inquisitor would give a subtle nod to the executioner. The first turn of the windlass would pull the ropes taut, removing all slack. This was the minor application, an intense, full-body strain that pulled the limbs unnaturally straight and forced the air from the lungs in a sharp gasp. It was a moment of terrifying tension, a physical promise of the horror to come. When the victim, teeth gritted, continued their denial, the executioner would apply more force, putting his weight into the lever. A loud, ominous, creaking groan would emanate from the wooden windlass, a sound that would forever be seared into the victim's memory. This is where the real structural pain began. The victim's muscles, already stretched to their absolute limit, would begin to tear. Ligaments, the tough, fibrous bands that hold the joints together, would be stretched like ancient, brittle rubber, far beyond their elastic capacity. The pain would be a white-hot, blinding fire erupting in the shoulders, elbows, hips, knees, and ankles simultaneously. Then came the sounds that marked the progressive destruction of the body. A series of dull, gristly, sickening pops, audible to everyone in the chamber. These were the sounds of the joints dislocating, one after another. The shoulders, with their wide range of motion, would likely go first. Then the elbows, then the hips, then the knees. With each turn of the lever, the victim's body would be physically elongated, their skeletal frame literally being pulled apart at its connections. Contemporary accounts, likely exaggerated for dramatic effect but conveying the perceived horror of the process, claimed a victim could be stretched by as much as a foot, 30 centimeters. As the torture continued, the damage became even more profound and systemic. The cartilage discs between the vertebrae of the spine would be compressed, bulging and rupturing, sending bolts of lightning like pain down the victim's back and legs. The vertebrae themselves could be pulled apart. The rib cage would be put under such immense strain that ribs could pop from the sternum or be pulled from their cartilage connections to the spine. The victim was being systematically unjointed, their skeletal structure dismantled and ruined. They were no longer a human form, but a grotesque caricature of one, a screaming, elongated figure of pure pain. The pain was so absolute, so all-consuming, that the world would dissolve into a white haze of pure agony. The mind, completely overwhelmed by the sensory overload, could barely form a coherent thought. The goal of the rack was to annihilate the will by annihilating the body's integrity, to sever the connection between mind and flesh, leaving the consciousness adrift and drowning in an ocean of unbearable physical sensation. It was designed to make the idea of continued resistance more terrifying than any confession, no matter how false or damning. The rack was a fixture in the Tower of London for punishing traitors like Guy Fawkes, and a key tool of Inquisition torture in parts of Europe, particularly in Germany. It was a machine that required a certain amount of space and engineering, making it a more formal and significant instrument than the strappado. Its effects were devastating and almost always permanent. A person who had been severely racked would never walk properly again, if they could walk at all. Their arms might hang uselessly. They would live the rest of their lives in chronic, crippling, arthritic pain. The rack's place at number 2 is secured by its sheer, all-encompassing, systematic brutality. It was not a tool for targeted, specific pain. It was a machine for total anatomical destruction. It represents the pinnacle of mechanical ingenuity applied to the deconstruction of the human form, making it one of the most feared and truly brutal tools in the entire history of torture. Honorable, or perhaps more accurately, dishonorable mentions. Before we unveil our number 1 pick, it is worth pausing to acknowledge a few other devices that, while perhaps not as common or as systematically brutal as our top contenders, are still deserving of a place in this dark gallery of human cruelty. They illustrate the sheer variety and targeted nature of the torturer's art. The iron spider or breast ripper, a terrifyingly specific and misogynistic tool. This was a large, claw-like device, often made of iron, that was designed to be heated over a brazier. It was then used to seize and tear a woman's breast. It was a punishment often reportedly reserved for women accused of adultery, heresy, self-induced abortion, or other female crimes. It was a tool of pure, gendered terror, mutilation, and shaming, designed to destroy a symbol of femininity and motherhood. The Spanish boot, or the boot/brodequin, this was a device designed to inflict a focused and escalating crushing force on the foot and leg. In its simplest form, used in France and known as the brodequin, wedges were hammered with a mallet between the victim's leg and boards that encased it, progressively tightening the device and shattering the bones. A more sophisticated version, often called the Spanish boot, consisted of a metal case for the foot and lower leg that was slowly tightened with a powerful screw mechanism. The executioner would turn the screw, progressively crushing the delicate bones of the foot and the larger bones of the shin, the tibia and fibula, into a bloody pulp. The pain was exquisite, and the damage was permanent, ensuring the victim would be crippled for life. The water cure, or taca, this was a favorite of the Spanish Inquisition, a method that inflicted immense suffering while leaving few external marks. The victim was tied to a ladder or a purpose-built rack with their head positioned lower than their feet. A piece of cloth, taca, was placed over their mouth and forced partly down their throat. Water, sometimes from a great height to increase the force, was then slowly and continuously poured onto the cloth. The victim would be forced to swallow the cloth and the water to avoid suffocating. This induced the terrifying sensation of drowning. The process would be repeated, with the interrogator forcing the victim to ingest gallons of water, distending their stomach to an enormous, painful degree and causing immense internal pressure and pain. Afterwards, the victim might be placed on their stomach, and the executioner would stand or jump on them, forcing the water out in a violent, agonizing rush. It was a torture that attacked the primal fear of drowning and inflicted immense psychological terror and physical suffering. Each of these devices represents a unique facet of the cruel creativity of the age. But one form of torture stands above them all in its uniquely diabolical combination of focused agony, prolonged psychological terror, and profound symbolic humiliation. Number 1. The Judas chair, or Judas cradle/the vigil. We have arrived at the summit of our grim mountain. We are at the top of our historical ranking. The device that takes the number 1 spot is not the most mechanically complex, nor the one that causes the most widespread damage to the body in the manner of the rack. Instead, it is a tool of slow, focused, and exquisitely refined cruelty, a torture that combines intense, escalating physical pain with profound and unbearable humiliation. This is the Judas chair, also known as the Judas cradle or simply the vigil. Attributed by some to the Italian jurist Ippolito Marsili in the early modern period, the Judas chair was, according to its proponents, designed as a more humane alternative to other, more destructive tortures. It was claimed that it would not break bones or cause permanent injury, thus technically adhering to the inquisitorial rules against mutilation and bloodshed. This claim is a masterpiece of dark, cynical irony, a lie so profound it becomes a form of psychological torture in itself. Imagine a tall, pyramid-shaped seat made of wood or iron, with the point honed to a sharp, unforgiving tip and aimed directly upwards. This pyramid was mounted on a sturdy tripod-like stool. The victim would be systematically stripped naked, an initial act of humiliation and dehumanization. Ropes and pulleys attached to the ceiling would then be used to hoist them above the device, their arms and legs often tied in a way that rendered them completely helpless. Then, very, very slowly, they would be lowered onto the razor-sharp point of the pyramid. The point was designed to be inserted into the victim's anus, or, for female victims, the vagina. It could also be used under the coccyx, the tailbone, Let the full horror of that sink in. All of the victim's body weight, every pound, was concentrated on a single, sharp, unyielding point, impaling the most sensitive, nerve-rich, and private part of their body. The pain would have been immediate, sharp, and absolutely breathtaking, a bolt of pure agony that would eclipse all thought. But the true, diabolical brutality of the Judas chair was in its slow, controlled, and prolonged application. This was not a quick impalement. The executioner, with his system of ropes and pulleys, could control the pressure with micrometer-like precision. He could lower the victim just enough for the point to stretch and break the skin, then hold them there suspended in agony for hours. This was the origin of the name the Vigil, as it was a torture designed to prevent sleep. He could raise and lower the victim repeatedly, a process called rocking the cradle, causing the point to grind and tear at the surrounding tissue. He could lower them further, causing the point to slowly, agonizingly, tear its way deeper into the body. The physical pain was only one component of this multifaceted torture. The humiliation was profound. The victim was naked, exposed, vulnerable, and being violated in the most degrading way imaginable in front of a panel of robed, male inquisitors and officials. The process was slow and deliberate, giving the victim ample time to contemplate their situation, the shame, the helplessness, and the escalating, unbearable agony. And the cynical claim that it was humane and left no permanent injury was a grotesque lie. While it might not have broken bones in the same way as the rack or the boot, the risk of fatal injury was immense. The sharp point could easily cause massive internal tearing and hemorrhaging. Even if the victim survived the ordeal itself, the unhygienic nature of the device, which was rarely if ever cleaned between uses, meant that the risk of a severe, raging infection was almost certain. A slow, agonizing death from peritonitis, sepsis, or gangrene days or weeks later was a very likely, if not intended, outcome. The Judas chair is our number one pick because it represents the perfect storm of Inquisition torture philosophy. It inflicted a focused, controllable, and utterly excruciating pain. It was an act of supreme humiliation and degradation, and it operated under the cynical, legalistic guise of being a lesser form of torture, a procedural nicety that allowed the inquisitors to claim they were not violating their own rules against permanent mutilation or bloodshed. It was a torture that attacked the body, the mind, the victim's sense of human dignity, and their very soul all at once. It was not a machine of brute force like the rack, but a precision instrument of agony and shame. For its unique and diabolical combination of refined cruelty, prolonged psychological terror, and cynical hypocrisy, the Judas chair stands at the pinnacle, the blood-soaked apex, of our historical ranking of the most brutal tools of the age. So there we have it, a descent into the dark engineering of pain, from the nagging torment of the heretic's fork to the focused, violating agony of the Judas chair. This historical ranking is more than just a grim list. It's a window into a world where belief was absolute, where heresy was the ultimate crime, and where the human body was seen as a stubborn flesh-and-blood lock that contained a divine truth, a lock that could, and must, be forced open with these brutal tools. The men who designed and operated these devices were not necessarily cackling, monstrous sadists in their own eyes. They were often educated, pious, and highly logical men who believed they were performing a necessary, if unpleasant, duty. They saw themselves as physicians of the soul, and these were their surgical instruments. They were acting within a complex legal and theological framework that justified their actions as a means to a noble end, the salvation of an individual soul from eternal damnation, and the protection of the entire body of Christendom from the contagion of heresy. And this is perhaps the most chilling and vital lesson of all. These instruments of Inquisition torture were not the products of a chaotic, savage madness. They were the products of a cold, rational, and ordered system. A system that had an answer for everything. A system that believed so profoundly and unshakably in its own righteousness that it could justify any cruelty in its name. The creak of the rack has fallen silent. The Judas chair gathers dust in a museum display case. But the mindset that created them, the absolute certainty that our truth is the only truth, and that any means are justified to defend it against the heretic, the other, the unbeliever, that is a ghost that has never truly been exorcised from the human experience. It is a warning, written in iron and blood and tears, that echoes down the centuries to our own, more complicated, but perhaps no less certain, and no less dangerous age. Thank you for joining us on this difficult but important journey through the arsenal of the Inquisition. Confronting these brutal tools is not about sensationalism. It is essential to understanding the extremes of human cruelty, the terrifying power of ideology, and the precious fragility of tolerance and doubt. If you found this historical ranking and deep dive into Inquisition torture compelling and informative, please show your support by liking this video and subscribing to Torture History. Click the notification bell to ensure you don't miss our next exploration of the darker side of our shared past. And now, we want to hear from you. Which of these devices do you find the most disturbing, and why? Is it the systematic physical destruction of the rack, the insidious psychological torment of the heretic's fork, or the profoundly humiliating violation of the Judas chair? What does the very existence of these objects tell us about the complex and often terrifying relationship between power, religion, and the human body? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. Your engagement, your questions, and your insights help us to continue this important work. Until next time, remember that the most dangerous tools are not always made of iron, but of unquestionable ideas.